For 3 centuries, Louisiana has used one word to build a people, divide families, protect status, erase history, and decide who was permitted to belong. That word was Creole. At different moments, it described people born in the colony rather than overseas, French-speaking white families, enslaved Africans born in Louisiana, free people of color, rural communities, city elites, musicians, cooks, Catholics, speakers of Louisiana Creole, and descendants whose families crossed several of those worlds at once. One person could proudly claim the name, while a neighbor with similar ancestors rejected it. A family might use it inside the home, but choose a different racial category on official forms. Historians argued over the definition. Communities argued over ownership. Outsiders kept trying to force one answer onto a word that had never lived inside one box. Then, geneticists examined DNA from Louisiana participants who identified themselves as Creole. The result did not reveal one secret race. It revealed why every racial purity story had failed. In a 2012 study, researchers analyzed ancestry markers from men recruited in Louisiana and North Carolina for a prostate cancer research project. Among participants who identified as Black or African American in Louisiana, those who also identified as Creole showed statistically different average African and European ancestry from Black Louisiana participants who claimed no additional ethnicity. The label, at least inside that specific sample, corresponded with a measurable difference in population history. But the same study found no equivalent Creole ancestry distinction among participants identifying as European American. That contrast changed the entire interpretation. DNA was not declaring that one genome created every Louisiana Creole. It was showing that some African American Creole communities preserved a distinctive history of admixture, family formation, and relative social boundaries. Meanwhile, white people using the same word could overlap genetically with other white Louisianans because their Creole identity was cultural, historical, regional, or genealogical, rather than a separate biological cluster. The word was doing more than one job. The genome could see only some of them. A much larger 2015 study deepened the picture without studying Creoles as a single group. Researchers analyzed genetic data from more than 160,000 23andMe customers who identified as African American, Latino, or European American. State by state, they measured ancestry connected broadly to Africa, Europe, and indigenous peoples of the Americas. Louisiana stood out as a place where racial labels concealed older mixing. The researchers estimated that about 12% of self-identified European Americans in Louisiana and South Carolina carried at least 1% African ancestry. Around 8% of self-identified European Americans in Louisiana carried at least 1% Native American ancestry. Those were estimates from a self-selected customer database, not a census of Louisiana, and not a test of who qualified as Creole. But the pattern carried a devastating message for generations of racial gatekeeping. A person's public racial category could not reliably describe every ancestor inside their genome. The borders Louisiana defended socially had been crossed biologically for centuries. That is the verified genetic foundation of this story. The 2012 research detected ancestry differences associated with Creole self-identification among one group of Black Louisiana participants. The 2015 research showed widespread hidden admixture within American racial categories and unusually high traces of African and Native American ancestry among some white Louisianans. Neither study discovered a single Louisiana Creole genome. Neither proved that all Creoles share African, European, and Native American ancestry in one fixed ratio. Neither gave genetics the authority to decide who is culturally Creole. What the studies destroyed was the idea that Louisiana's old racial categories had ever been biologically clean. To understand why that mattered, the story must begin with the word before race hardened around it. Creole entered the colonial Americas through related Portuguese, Spanish, and French terms used for people, animals, goods, and cultures produced locally rather than imported from an overseas homeland. In Louisiana, the meaning shifted across time and context. It could identify a person born in the colony, including someone of European ancestry, someone of African ancestry, or someone whose family crossed those lines. The earliest uses did not describe one skin color. They distinguished the locally born from newcomers. A child born to French parents in Louisiana could be Creole. An enslaved person born in Louisiana rather than Africa could be called Creole. A locally born person of mixed ancestry could be Creole. Over generations, the word accumulated language, religion, food, music, family memory, and attachment to place. It became less like a box and more like a layered claim. We were made here. Louisiana itself was made through forced and voluntary movement. French and Spanish colonists arrived from Europe. Enslaved Africans were transported from several regions, especially West and West Central Africa. Indigenous nations already occupied and shaped the land, traded with newcomers, resisted expansion, suffered violence and disease, and entered new communities through alliance, captivity, marriage, and adoption. Migrants arrived from the Caribbean, including large numbers connected to Saint-Domingue and the Haitian Revolution. Acadians, Germans, Canary Islanders, Anglo-Americans, and others added further layers. New Orleans became a port where Atlantic and continental histories met under unequal conditions. Mixture happened, but the word mixture can hide the violence inside it. Many family lines joining European men and African or indigenous women were formed within slavery and colonial power. Some relationships involved marriage, affection, negotiation, or long-term partnership. Others involved coercion, sale, dependency, and rape. Enslaved women could not negotiate as equals with men who owned them or controlled their freedom. Free women of color possessed more legal agency, but still lived inside systems structured by race, sex, and wealth. Popular histories often describe plissage as a formal organized system in which white men entered recognized arrangements with free women of color and provided property or education for children. Such relationships existed, but historians caution against imagining one standardized institution governing them all. Family arrangements varied enormously, and romantic language can disguise exploitation. DNA records that ancestry joined. It cannot tell us whether the joining was loving or violent. That difference is held in documents, law, oral history, and power. Under French and Spanish rule, Louisiana developed a substantial population of free people of color, often called gens de couleur libre. Some had been freed from slavery, some were born free. Some descended from mixed families. Their circumstances ranged from poverty to considerable wealth. Certain free people of color owned property, operated businesses, practiced skilled trades, served in militias, received education, composed music, and built institutions. Some also owned enslaved people, participating in the same brutal economy that constrained their own rights. Their existence complicates every simple moral and racial diagram. They were neither one uniform middle class nor merely an exception to slavery. They were a legally distinct population living within it. The Code Noir, applied in French Louisiana in 1724, regulated slavery and the lives of free and enslaved black people. It imposed Catholic requirements, restricted relationships, defined punishment, and attempted to govern manumission and status. Spanish administration later altered some legal practices, and opportunities for freedom could expand or contract according to period, place, wealth, sex, and political need. By the end of the colonial era, Louisiana contained white Creoles, enslaved black Creoles, free Creoles of color, immigrants, indigenous communities, and people who moved between languages and identities. The society was not racially fluid in the sense of equality. It was violently hierarchical, but it contained more recognized statuses than the two-part racial system Anglo-Americans increasingly brought after the Louisiana Purchase. When the United States acquired Louisiana in 1803, English-speaking newcomers entered a city whose French and Spanish residents often viewed them as cultural outsiders. White Creoles defended language, Catholicism, family prestige, and claims to colonial ancestry. Creoles of color defended their own institutions, education, property, and status. Both could use Creole to distinguish themselves from Americans. The word created connection and conflict at the same time. A white Creole and a Creole of color might speak related French varieties, attend Catholic churches, eat related foods, carry some of the same surnames, and understand the same local customs. They did not possess equal rights or occupy equal social positions. Cultural overlap did not cancel white supremacy. This contradiction is one reason the later argument became so fierce. If Creole described local culture, several racial groups could claim it. If Creole meant pure colonial European descent, white elites could monopolize it. If Creole meant only mixed-race people, white colonial families disappeared from the definition. If it meant any Louisiana-born person, the term became too broad for communities that had built specific identities around it. No definition solved every historical use. During the 19th century, some white writers increasingly insisted that true Creoles were exclusively white descendants of French or Spanish colonists. This was not simply a neutral dictionary correction. In a society making whiteness the entrance requirement for political and social power, controlling the word protected status. Families revised genealogies. African ancestors could be omitted, reclassified, or transformed into servants. Indigenous ancestry might be celebrated romantically while African ancestry was denied. A relative who crossed the color line could disappear from one branch's story and remain central in another. The genome now demonstrates why claims of absolute purity deserve skepticism. It does not prove that every white Creole family has African or indigenous ancestry. It shows that non-European ancestry exists among a notable minority of white-identified Louisianans, and that self-identification can change long before inherited segments disappear. 1% of ancestry is small. It may represent one ancestor many generations ago, and statistical assignment near low thresholds requires caution. Yet even a small segment overturns a genealogy claiming that crossing never occurred. DNA does not expose moral guilt inherited through blood. It exposes the historical fiction of impermeable race. The 2015 study also found sex-biased ancestry patterns across American populations. In many African American genomes, European ancestry entered disproportionately through men, while African ancestry entered disproportionately through women. That pattern fits the gendered power of slavery, although genetics cannot identify the circumstances of every conception. For Louisiana Creole families, specific patterns vary and should not be assumed from national averages. Still, the broader American signal reminds us that admixture percentages are not neutral recipes. They can be demographic shadows cast by unequal power. A chromosome segment may survive from a relationship with no archive named. It may be the only remaining witness. The 2012 Louisiana study appears especially dramatic because self-identified Black Creole participants differed genetically from Black participants, reporting no additional ethnicity. But the study requires careful reading. The participants were men enrolled in a medical cohort, not a representative survey of every Creole parish, language community, social class, sex, or family. Ethnicity was self-reported. The ancestry references were broad proxies. The numbers in small subgroups could be influenced by who volunteered and how they understood the labels. The authors found a statistical association within that data set. They did not discover a biological test for Creoleness. A larger community study could find additional subgroups or overlapping patterns. Rural Cane River Creoles, New Orleans Afro-Creoles, White Creoles, Louisiana Creole speakers, families identifying primarily as Black, and families identifying primarily as French or Cajun may carry different histories. Culture can preserve a boundary without creating a sharply separated gene pool. A genetically subtle difference can still accompany a culturally powerful identity. This is exactly what population genetics finds elsewhere. Groups can share most ancestry with neighbors while differing slightly because of marriage networks, migration, geography, religion, or founder events. A computer detects average patterns across thousands of markers. That does not turn the groups into separate races. The Creole participants were not biologically outside African American history. Their genomes reflected a particular route through it. The strongest part of the reference story says the DNA confirmed a triracial people. That description fits many Louisiana families with African, European, and Indigenous ancestry, and it has cultural importance in some Creole communities. It cannot be universalized. Some Creoles have little or no detectable Native American ancestry. Some white Creole families may be overwhelmingly European. Some Black Creole families may carry predominantly African ancestry with varying European contributions. Caribbean ancestry can be present without fitting neatly into continental categories because Caribbean populations were already mixed before reaching Louisiana. Even the label African hides diversity. Enslaved people brought to Louisiana came through different ports, regions, and historical periods. Senegambia, the Bight of Benin, West Central Africa, and other areas contributed people with distinct languages and cultures. Many passed through Caribbean colonies. Their descendants cannot be reduced to one West African source. European ancestry was also diverse. French, Spanish, German, Irish, Italian, and other lineages entered Louisiana at different times. Native American ancestry may connect to several nations and roots, but consumer DNA often cannot identify a specific tribe from a small segment. Tribal citizenship is political, cultural, genealogical, and communal, not something a commercial percentage can grant. The phrase triracial can illuminate the mixture. It can also flatten the people being mixed. The legal system flattened them more brutally. After the Civil War, Reconstruction briefly expanded political participation and civil rights for Black Louisianans. Creoles of color played major roles in journalism, education, music, military service, legal activism, and campaigns for equality. New Orleans contained one of the nation's most organized Afro-Creole civil rights traditions. White supremacist violence and law then dismantled those gains. Segregation increasingly forced a binary racial order onto people whose families had occupied more complex colonial categories. The social distance separating some Creoles of color from other Black communities weakened under shared exclusion, although class, language, color, and identity differences did not vanish. The confrontation reached the railroad. Homer Plessy was an Afro-Creole shoemaker and member of the Citizens Committee formed to challenge Louisiana's Separate Car Act. In 1892, as part of a planned test case, he entered a railway car designated for white passengers and identified his ancestry so that authorities would arrest him. The case was designed around the absurdity of race classification. Plessy was described in court records as 7/8 white and 1/8 African, with ancestry not visually apparent. The state nevertheless treated him as legally colored. In 1896, the United States Supreme Court upheld Louisiana's segregation law in Plessy v. Mr. Ferguson gave constitutional protection to the doctrine later summarized as separate but equal. The decision did not create one national one-drop statute or genetically define Blackness. Different states used different ancestry fractions and racial rules. But Plessy strengthened a racial regime in which law could place a person inside a category regardless of appearance, culture, or personal identity. The court could command where Plessy sat. It could not reorganize his chromosomes. That is the powerful connection between the legal and genetic stories. Louisiana law treated race as a boundary the state could identify and police. Modern genomics shows ancestry as a mosaic of segments inherited through many lines. The legal box was absolute. The biological history was continuous and mixed, but genetics does not automatically liberate identity. A DNA test can become another authority telling people what they are. Someone receives an ancestry estimate and believes a percentage overrules family, language, community, and lived experience. That repeats the old mistake with newer technology. Race is not a direct biological map. Ethnicity is not a chromosome. Creole identity cannot be calculated by adding 3 percentages. Ancestry estimates themselves can change when companies update algorithms and reference panels. Neighboring populations are difficult to distinguish. Small segments may be reassigned. Siblings receive different pieces from the same parents. A documented ancestor may leave no detectable DNA after enough generations, while their culture and name remain central to the family. Genetics is strongest when testing demographic claims across groups. It is weaker as a judge of individual belonging. The phrase DNA settled the debate is therefore true only if the debate is defined carefully. DNA settled that Louisiana's racial categories were never sealed biological populations. It settled that substantial admixture occurred across categories people later described as white, black, and Native American. It supported the conclusion that some self-identified Black Creole participants carried a distinguishable average ancestry history within one Louisiana medical cohort. It did not settle who was allowed to use the word Creole. No laboratory can do that. The word includes culture, Louisiana Creole language, regional French, Catholic traditions, Protestant traditions in some communities, foodways, music, kinship neighborhood, rural and urban life, and memories of slavery, freedom, migration, and segregation. The Louisiana Creole language itself emerged through contact among French varieties and African languages in a colonial slave society. It became a complete community language with its own grammar, not broken French. Speakers included enslaved and free people, and the language crossed racial categories. Later pressure from English-only schooling, discrimination, migration, and the prestige of French or English caused language loss. Some people retained Creole identity after losing the language. Others speak it while using different ethnic labels. Again, one marker cannot define the whole. Cuisine offers another illustration, but not because DNA is literally a recipe. Gumbo can draw from African culinary knowledge, indigenous ingredients, European methods, and local environments. Jambalaya, sauces, rice dishes, sausages, seafood traditions, and sweets developed through repeated adaptation. Calling each dish French plus African plus native misses what happened in Louisiana. The sources did not remain untouched. They produced something locally coherent. Families did the same biologically and culturally, but with one difference. Food metaphors can make forced ancestry sound voluntary. A cook chooses ingredients. Enslaved people did not choose the system transporting and exploiting them. The Creole story contains creation and violence at once. Any powerful script must preserve both. It must also distinguish Creole from Cajun without building another wall. Cajuns descend historically from Acadian exiles and developed a distinctive Louisiana culture. Creole and Cajun communities interacted, intermarried, shared music and food, and influenced each other. Over time, labels shifted. Some traditions now marketed as Cajun include Creole contributions, while public culture often uses Creole as a synonym for urban, mixed, or spicy. Real families do not always follow tourist definitions. A surname can appear in both identities. A person can have Cajun and Creole ancestors. A language speaker may choose one label in one context and another elsewhere. DNA cannot draw a border that history repeatedly crossed. The most revealing evidence may be family silence. In Louisiana and across the United States, relatives sometimes changed racial identification between censuses. A child classified one way could become an adult classified another. A family moving to a new town might pass as white. Another branch remained within a Creole of color community. The branches could lose contact and construct opposite ancestry stories. Modern testing can reconnect distant cousins whose documents place them on different sides of the color line. The discovery can be emotional, but the DNA has not changed. Only the story has opened. This is why the 12% finding among white-identified Louisiana and South Carolina customers became so widely discussed. It showed that ancestry hidden by social classification remained statistically detectable generations later, but the number should never be turned into an accusation that every white Louisianan is secretly black or that identity is fraudulent. 1% ancestry does not determine culture, and customer samples contain biases. The result describes historical permeability, not a new one-drop rule in reverse. The ethical lesson is to stop treating ancestry as contamination. African ancestry does not make a person less European. European ancestry does not make a black person less black. Native American ancestry does not create tribal citizenship. Mixed ancestry does not make someone incomplete. The categories were created by societies. People survived inside, across, and beyond them. The Creole debate often asks which side owns the name, white or black, European or African, pure, colonial, or mixed. DNA refuses the structure of that question. Different Creole communities can be historically real at the same time. White Creoles existed. Creoles of color existed. Enslaved black Creoles existed. Afro-Creole communities exist. Mixed families existed. The words' meanings changed without one meaning retroactively erasing the others. The genetics supports plurality because the history produced plurality. The final reveal is not that everyone called Creole shares the same hidden bloodline. It is that Creole was never fundamentally a blood quantum category. It named people created in Louisiana's colonial world and the cultures their descendants defended. Biology participated in that creation, but culture gave it language, memory, and continuity. The 2012 study caught one genetic echo of that history among black men who identified as Creole. The 2015 study exposed ancestry crossing the public color line across Louisiana. Together, they undermine purity and legal simplification. They do not replace community history with a laboratory certificate. For a person carrying Louisiana Creole heritage, that may be the most important answer. You do not need to prove an exact percentage to validate your family's language, parish, church, recipes, music, surnames, or oral history. DNA can support migration and admixture. Documents can identify ancestors. Neither alone contains the whole identity. A genome is inherited. A people are made. Louisiana Creoles were made through African survival, European colonization, indigenous presence, Caribbean migration, local birth, forced intimacy, chosen family, freedom struggles, and generations who refused to let outsiders define the word completely. That history is not tidy enough for a racial box. It is strong enough to survive one. The old purity faction was wrong because Louisiana's biological history crossed the boundaries it defended. The one-drop regime was wrong because one ancestry line cannot erase all the others or determine a person's complete humanity. The simplistic triracial formula is incomplete because not every Creole carries the same sources or proportions, and the idea that genetics can issue a final identity. Verdict is wrong because culture cannot be sequenced. DNA settled the part of the debate DNA was capable of settling. It revealed the mixture. It revealed hidden continuity. It revealed that self-identification sometimes tracked real demographic history, and then it reached its limit. The word Creole continued beyond the chromosome. That is where the real answer lives. Louisiana Creoles were never one race pretending to be another. They were never one fixed percentage. They were never a contradiction requiring America to choose which half was real. They were several communities shaped by the same extraordinary place, carrying overlapping histories that laws and later definitions tried to separate. The genome did not choose between white Creole and Creole of color. It exposed the belief that only one could be authentic. For centuries, people fought over who owned the word. DNA revealed that ownership was the wrong question. Creole did not begin as a wall around blood. It began as a statement of creation here. There is one final reason the distinction matters. Genetic ancestry is not inherited in equal visible portions from every genealogical ancestor. Each generation reshuffles chromosomes. After enough time, a real ancestor may contribute no segment that current tests can detect. Another ancestor from the same generation may contribute several surviving pieces. That means a person can descend from an indigenous ancestor, documented in church and civil records, while receiving no confidently assigned Native American segment. Another relative may inherit one. Neither result changes the genealogy. The same process complicates African and European ancestry. Percentages are estimates of DNA, not percentages of family loyalty or historical influence. A grandmother can shape language, religion, recipes, and identity far beyond the fraction of DNA her descendants happen to retain. Creole history was transmitted through kitchens, courtyards, churches, music rooms, workshops, farms, markets, newspapers, schools, and family names. Those transmissions do not follow recombination. A song can pass intact through 10 generations, even when the singer's precise genetic segments do not. This is why community participation matters. Identity grows through recognition and relationship. A laboratory can reveal an unexpected cousin, but it cannot supply the years of shared life that make kinship meaningful. Genetics can also miss people because research participation is unequal. Commercial databases overrepresent customers with money, internet access, and interest in ancestry testing. Medical cohorts recruit according to disease studies rather than cultural representation. People wary of institutions may be absent for good historical reasons. A study's silence about a community does not prove the community lacks a genetic history. It may mean the community was never properly sampled. Future Louisiana research could involve Creole communities directly, collect detailed genealogies and regional histories, and use whole genome data to study how African, European, Caribbean, and indigenous-related ancestries entered different family networks. Such work could clarify migration without turning identity into a specimen. Consent would be essential, so would community control over questions, language, data use, and interpretation. Populations whose identities were repeatedly classified by outsiders have reason to resist another institution claiming ownership over their bodies. The best science would not ask, "Who is a real Creole?" It would ask how different Creole communities formed, moved, intermarried, maintained languages, and survived political pressure. The answer would likely be several histories rather than one. New Orleans would not tell the entire story. Cane River would not tell the entire story. One church, surname, parish, skin color, or language would not tell the entire story. Each would reveal a section of a population formed across rural and urban Louisiana and carried into Texas, California, Illinois, and other destinations through later migration. The diaspora added another layer. Families leaving Louisiana sometimes simplified their identity because outsiders did not understand Creole. Some became identified only as Black, some passed as white, some used French, Spanish, Mexican, or Native labels, depending on local categories. Children could grow up knowing the word without knowing its history. DNA testing now returns some descendants to Louisiana records, but the result should be an opening, not a verdict. A match can suggest which archive to search. It cannot replace the archive. The deepest lesson is that categories can be historically powerful, even when biologically unstable. White and Black determined property, movement, education, marriage, safety, and survival. Their biological borders were porous, but their legal consequences were real. Creole identity developed inside that contradiction. It named local creation, while race law demanded separation. The people carrying it were not confused. The system around them was unable to tolerate complexity. That is what the DNA finally exposes. Not a hidden percentage, but the failure of a nation's categories to describe the people it governed. The genome is not the definition of Creole. It is evidence against every definition built on purity. Purity survives only when history is shortened. Louisiana's full history is too long, too connected, and too human for that illusion. Every parish archive, baptismal record, manuscript paper, marriage, migration, and DNA segment adds another crossing. The crossings do not weaken Creole identity. They explain why it endured. The name survived because it described creation from contact, not isolation from it. Once that is understood, the debate loses its false choice. Creole can hold African, European, Indigenous, Caribbean, white, Black, and mixed histories without reducing any person to a laboratory fraction. The word remains cultural precisely because its biological history was never singular.